Sorry, it's been a while since we've had any gathering like this at OR. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming out on this the first day that we can do something like this. Is it okay if I just remove my mask briefly? I've had so many PCR tests in the last 2 weeks. So before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the still unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. And we are grateful to be uninvited guests working here. We'll continue to work towards reconciliation and being partners with the First Nations in working and living on this land and territory. Again, thanks for coming to OR, and please respect everyone's boundaries as we're all sort of figuring out how to be together. Thanks for wearing your masks, and if there's any safety concerns, just let us know. We haven't had a contact tracing list, but I think since most of you signed up through the Eventbrite, we'll keep that to keep in touch with you. And speaking of which, signing up for newsletters is a great way to learn about these events, and just a few announcements. Coming up on March 5th, we'll open our next exhibition featuring the work of Wes Harmon and Pamela Garu. And then on March 19th, we'll have a sidewalk launch, finally, for the permanent installation and launch of Devon Knowles' public work, which we've commissioned through the City of Vancouver's public art program. So please, again, sign up or follow whatever social media you prefer to find out more about that. We'd love to see you back if everything allows. Let's get right to it, because we are starting a bit after 6 today. So I'm really happy to introduce Kristian, Vistrup, Madsen, and Tiziana and Melia. This gathering is on the occasion for the launch of Kristian's book, Doing Time, Essays on Using People. But please also have a look at Tiziana's publications, which we are featuring at the front and are generally in circulation at OR Gallery and OR Bookstore. And we have these for special launch price of $30 today. They're also on sale at Read Books, so if that's more convenient for you. It's not about book sales, it's about just getting the books, so however you want to get them. So thanks again to Read for also featuring those. Just a note that this talk is being recorded. We'd like to be able to post it onto our brand new website when that's launched later this spring, along with other archived talks. So hopefully that doesn't make you too nervous. And also wine and refreshments are at the front. Please help yourself. Washrooms are through this doorway and all the way to the back. Again, wear your mask throughout because it's common space shared with our studio tenants and neighbors. I think, so Tiziana has kind of set up the structure of this event. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So there'll be some reading, some conversation, maybe music, maybe not. And we would love to open up the floor to questions, so I'll just give a signal after about 40 minutes and help moderate that. And just for introductions, so Kristian Vistrup Madsen is a writer based in Berlin. He's a contributor to magazines such as Artform, Frieze, Texter Kunst, and Kunstkritik, and the recipient of the 2020 Broken Image Press Novel Prize. Was it for this book?
No, it's for an upcoming book.
Oh wow, there's more, okay. And he's been kind of on a writer's residency for the last, 2.5 weeks? It was kind of a really last minute thing. We can barely afford to bring in wonderful people to OR as often as we'd like. But I was away, and so I thought I'd just turn my apartment into a residency for Kristian. We met years ago when I lived in Berlin. I remember you mentioning too that you were working on this. So it's nice to see it come to fruition, and so I thought I'd just take advantage and invite Kristian over to meet a lot of wonderful people in this city, and doing that he's done really well, I think, very busy over the last few weeks. Yeah, I'd like to thank actually Willa Bale and many others in this room for hosting Kristian and kind of welcoming him to the city. As I was away, I couldn't be the most present host, but I'm glad that the city stepped in and welcomed him. Yeah, and there's a couple more days of, I guess, visiting and studio visits, and then Monday you go back to Berlin. But yeah, it's been great, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I can't wait to hear what your thoughts on Vancouver are. And Tiziana, Melia, we all know and love, grew up in the Okanagan region of British Columbia, now lives in Vancouver. Her paintings, textiles, installations, and collaborations and writing are concerned with overlapping registers of perception, feeling, memory, and narrative. I'd also like to point out that you've got a publication coming out with archive books soon, right?
Yeah.
Is there any date or range of dates?
It's like set scheduled for the spring, but possibly the fall. Depends on. There's so many people involved, so
yeah,
it's hard to know exactly.
Plus the pandemic.
Yeah, there's either people getting sick or falling in love, so delays constantly. Maybe it's the same thing.
Well, another book launch coming up then. And so Tiziana and Kristian met through this visit, and I'm glad that you both did. I just thought that knowing the way that art and writing plays a part in each of your practices, that it would be an interesting conversation, and definitely, yeah, not to put too much pressure on you, but I've been looking forward to it. And with that, I'll just leave it to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Denise, and thanks everybody for coming. It's pretty surreal being here. I know you've had like some book launches, but in Vancouver, I haven't been like in-person situation in a long time, probably like a couple of years. Yeah, special.
Yeah. I guess I'll also just say thank you so much, Denise and Or Gallery, for having me and for these last 2 weeks, which have been amazing. I've met so many lovely, interesting, smart people here. So I am very, very happy to be in Vancouver and to get to know this place. So, yeah.
Yeah, I hope you come back.
Yeah.
And it's not your first time, actually.
No, it's not. I've been having all these weird like flashback memories from like a sort of more or less strange time I had when I was a teenager. I was on exchange in Idaho when I was 15, and during that time I came here for a couple of days, and it's like a trip that I've actually kind of, to a pretty great extent, like repressed, and now I'm coming back in these flashes. But yeah, this time is much better.
Yeah, so like congratulations on this book. I really enjoyed it, and it is a page turner, even though it took me like several days to read it. And I wasn't familiar with Kristian's writing before Denise invited me, and I sort of slowly would like go onto your website and like read an article here and there. And but yeah, I guess you're also like known for these like art form diaries and a sort of like seeing reportage type of texts. But anyways, like I was immediately intrigued by like the title of your book before I even knew anything about it. Doing Time, Essays on Using People. And then when we finally met, you were like, this book is not about art, and it's not, it's about the prison industrial complex. And you were like, does anybody even care about Chris Kraus anymore? And like, I was like, oh weird, like what is this? I was like really struck by all these comments, and I was like, okay, interesting. Then like suddenly like Doing Time and Using People had like a completely different connotation, even though I don't fully agree that it's not about art, but it kind of brings together these two different activities of like correspondence to the pen pal. So like the kind of frame of the book is like you writing someone who is in a prison in California named Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can start by kind of outlining the like how it began. It started in 2015. I was on a writing MFA in London, and for no reason really to do with my writing, I started corresponding with someone who was in prison in the United States named Michael, who's in a prison in California. There's just sort of there's a whole online infrastructure in the United States that allows you to do that. So I just started corresponding with him, and then as my final project developed for the MFA, it became clear that this was the most interesting writing that was happening in my life was this letter writing, and so the project began to take shape. The oldest of the essays in the book is from 2016, and it was the essay that I wrote for when I graduated from the RCA, and this is the most. This is the part that's most obviously about the prison industrial complex and about Michael's and my relationship. And that was really how it started. It's much more philosophical and a little bit more kind of thorny, maybe, more references to theory and to philosophy and to politics, to all of this sort of legal information about how the prison industrial complex works. And that, in the beginning, I didn't want to publish it. I thought it was too complicated. I couldn't sort of square the idea that I had used Michael's experience to kind of make this work of art. And so it was I had a sort of cowardly compromise, but it was published in a Swedish translation.
So it had never been published in English, but you had it translated to Swedish?
Yeah, it happened to be that I was invited to publish it in Sweden, and so it had this strange life there. Which meant that I was invited to a couple of different institutions to lecture about the work, and those lectures then made in the years after, which is the essay called Using People and the one called Skin Hunger. They sort of relate to the original project, but also sort of spin it into new directions that are closer to art and closer to writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you want to read from Cooper in Skin Hunger? It kind of gives us a bit of insight into some of the questions that come up in the book.
So this is a little, there's one essay called Skin Hunger, which is grouped into these different small chapters. Each have the name of a guy that I was seeing, and then I started writing short stories about. And that's when I kind of began this more meta reflection, coming back to the whole project with Michael. What does it actually mean to use other real people and their experiences and your own experience to make literature? What does it demand of you? And in the chapter... And
some of those people are actually artists too. Were they all artists or some of them?
Yeah, one was a filmmaker, the other ones were artists, yeah. Well, one was a banker.
Right.
And anyway, I think with this story about Cooper is when it starts to get quite meta, and I'm confronting some of these issues. This is the danger, Tank said to me. I had started reading the short stories aloud to anyone who would listen, that you become seduced by your own voice and forget about the people. You gotta leave it, went her advice, as she so often advised me on matters of love, before you become too invested. You have to stop writing. By then I had written another story about someone named Cooper, who had stumbled into my bed drunk with rapid assertive movements, a choreographed fall, I called it, thinking it was my flatmates. Not believing my luck, a cost-benefit analysis raced through my mind. Do I insist on waking him up and returning him to Alessio's bedroom? What if I don't? Since life has dealt me this card, who has dealt me this card? Should I use it? That is, should I touch him? I did touch him. This is an aspect of the story that would since be played down. On his back, arms over his head, the covers pushed off, he looked hot. I traced his armpits, his lightly hairy chest, the protruding abs. Embarrassingly, I spooned him until he rolled over onto his side, rejecting me. I left him alone. John Updike's 1968 novel, Couples, lay next to me on the mattress. Since Valentine's Day, I'd been listening to Esther Perel's podcast about couples therapy. I'd been thinking about Chris and how we fucked it up, how used I had become to carrying that wound, no longer as wound, but as a lack of certain things, like complication, frustration, as well as an opportunity to read more novels. Cooper, falling into my barren nest, fit perfectly with the narrative debris already there. Resting my head on the palm of my hand at 10 o'clock, free of the pathetic hesitations of the night, smile awry, I asked him, "So, are you ready to tell me who you are now?" He woke up instantly and looked around the room. "Do you even know where you are? If you say Friedrichshain, you're in trouble." He had some questions too. "Who's your flatmate? Is he nice?" "Medium height, dark hair, charming. You did well." "I have a boyfriend," he said. "Fuck, probably good that I came in here." This is how I felt. Mrs. Dalloway taking a nap in the afternoon. She sleeps in a room by herself at the top of the house in a single bed. Virginity clung to her like a sheet, Woolf wrote in 1925, a line that always stuck with me. I said to Cooper, "So that's why you came into my bed, a safe and sexless destination." We laughed, though I was only half joking. Then life, or whoever, dealt the story another ace. We turned out to have graduated from the same art school and in the same year. I was editing the school journal and had rejected Cooper's proposal. He since had grown a beard and cut his hair short, a miraculous kind of makeover available to some of the male sex that makes him instantly impossible to recognize. I pulled the publication out. I hadn't looked at it for years. We were both a bit shocked at being confronted with this weird fragment of our past. We wanted everything to be political, I told him. Like, if it isn't that, then why at all? An unreasonable thing to ask of culture, it strikes me now. It had been the last great gasp of that logic for me, and somehow for Cooper too. And so our serendipitous meeting spawned a critique of the political paradigm within which that journal was produced. The story became serious, and with that, valuable work. It contained analysis and description that, as someone whose livelihood is writing cultural criticism, I could not necessarily afford to throw away. At the same time, it seemed that the critical value of Cooper's story when it came to writing it down could not be disentangled from its more embodied and far too tender aspects. The reference to Woolf, the musty joy I took in making a caricature of my own chastity and using Cooper as a spotlight for my loneliness. It was both too embarrassing to share with its subject and too irresistible to give up. When Tank said, "You gotta leave it," that what she meant was, "There's no way you can publish this." But couldn't I have made this up? Who says I haven't? In the autumn of 2017, I toured a lecture called Using People, in which I parsed the problematics of employing experiences, particularly those of others, as raw material in art. The occasion was the publication of a Swedish translation of an excerpt from Doing Time in the literary journal Glenta. Doing Time was a product of the same mindset that had produced the very political school journal 2 years earlier, and as such, in its aftermath, I'd become fixated upon this issue. What does it mean to use people in the first place? Not the prison industrial complex, not the philosophy of freedom and difference and in or outside, what I had intended as the real subjects of that work, but can you? Gothenburg, Zurich, Berlin, Stockholm, I toured this anxiety. Am I even allowed to write this? In the lecture I argued that though it's no easy task, yes. But in the Q&A I'd always say anyway that I wouldn't do it again. I mean, next time it has to be less complicated, next time less exhausting. Writing is exhausting enough without ethical dilemmas trailing unresolved in its wake. Yet here I am again, too deep in Cooper and Ryan and the rest, not taking my friend's advice, not leaving it alone, but asking myself, why can't I just write fiction? Yeah, and funnily enough, when I read that now, it's like, it is fiction, you know, or like that. I guess that's the point, that it's constantly jumping back and forth between the moment I'm writing the story and the moment I'm writing the essay, and actually there's no difference.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something we were like talking about, but trying not to talk about because we were saving it to do here. And like, because so much of it is based on this correspondence, like of the book, like the other essays in the book, like at the start of Correspondence, there's a section that you cite Michael, who's your pen pal, and he talks a lot about like depiction, and I think in that you're also talking about making a promise that you'll visit each other, and for some reason that like made me think a lot about art writing and this like notion of a promise that is kind of like very ambiguous when there's this like interaction with an artist or this request to like write something. I'm not sure exactly what I'm getting with that, but like I think throughout the whole book there's this like, there are all these like simultaneous things happening where you're like writing about one thing, but it's also very layered and kind of pointing to these other issues.
I think it's something that definitely, like what's happening alongside my like processing the original work and like writing these lectures is just me working as an art critic. And I think that I also write a little bit about that in the first essay in the book, that like working as an art critic means like constantly having to be confronted with the like, with yourself as a kind of semi-public like subject or something, and that you're always disappointing someone or making someone happy or not, or like you're kind of put in, you're asked to take responsibility for your writing in public so often that it becomes less scary. And I think that was kind of like this kind of like trying for so long to avoid conflict, like with relation to this book, and then kind of more and more in my work life realizing that you actually can't. Was also part of why this in the end exists. So it does have to do with art writing.
Yeah, and then I wonder, because there's all these references to these various like white women and like pop culture. Like you write about Carrie Bradshaw, the columnist and protagonist for Sex and the City, and then who just like released her show just like that. Now she's middle-aged. And then on page 30, you confess that the pressure to do good was actually wanting to be Ally McBeal from the comedy drama television series that aired in the 90s to the early 2000s, who wore Calvin Klein suit shirts and chunky heels. And like these moments did feel like comic relief amidst like otherwise pretty heavy subjects of like love, like who gets to have like certain kinds of time, like you're in correspondence to someone who's like doing like 12 years in prison for like a relatively minor offense of like stealing a car, right? And I wondered like what your anxiety was. Like they almost seem like avatars, like these references, like of like you like identifying with them. And I can also like, I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say, but it's like these figures become like this composite character of like a guilt that like prompted the whole project almost. Or like I'm still not even clear because you don't really say in the book why you actually were like inspired to like first go on that website and find someone to write in the prison. Like that's just kind of happens. But
I mean, I think it comes up again in a little bit like in the first chapter where I'm describing, it's like you can also read the book as a kind of like a bit of a portrait of like a decade with identity politics in the art world, which begins in like 2012 when I start going to university in London, and I'm kind of describing this like kind of Goldsmiths moment of like Sarah Ahmed and like Occupy and like Beyonce being a feminist, and like how like that changed like discourse so much. And there's this one scene that's like set in a house party where some of them were all like 21 and
right,
and
you suddenly become politicized.
And like, yeah, this whole room is just kind of buzzing with the kind of sudden politicization of all these young people. And like this kind of strong feeling that like another scene like in a pub where we like cheers to like being the Trojan horse that like.
Oh yeah, the Trojan horse like stood out to me too, because it comes up a few times.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about that.
I mean,
did you actually cheers to being the Trojan horse?
I mean, I suppose I wrote it so many years later that of course it's like a bit of a fiction, but like I think it's true that like that there was always this weird incongruity to me that like on the one hand I would identify with being like Mrs. Dalloway who like gets her flowers herself, and like has this kind of like fake bougie life, and then on the other hand somebody who's like has like radical politics. And I guess that was the idea of the Trojan horse, that like that we could kind of smuggle these ideas into like art contexts, and that the like art that the art world would be this kind of activistic arena. And I think that that's where that this project really came from, that we had this strong feeling. I was at the Royal College of Art doing an MFA in writing, and we were kind of adamant that we couldn't write about art. That there was a strong feeling that it had to be about something real, and we had to do something real, and I guess that was also like what, there's this line of like that's what, in the end, it was paradoxically this like desire to be sort of activistic with my writing that landed me in this like troubled water of like appropriation, because I got too close. I felt like I had to have a personal connection in order to be able to write about this subject. But as I established that personal connection, I entered into another kind of difficult, sort of slippery ethical zone in relation to Michael. So really, the book is like a product of like trying to come to terms with like being a political, or thinking that you feeling a pressure to be like political or ethical, or like these conflations between politics, ethics, and morality, which is really which the narrator of the book I think is really struggling with, especially in the beginning.
Yeah, and then in your correspondence, Michael does like, you ask him, maybe that would be an interesting place to read.
Yeah.
Because he keeps using like words that like really stuck to me. Like you tried to like bring out like solidarity, and then he like uses the word unity.
Yeah, and I can just read that bit maybe. So like this comes right after I've introduced Michael's first letter. The effect was me sitting there at the other end with my mouth open, the expectation of surprise and its fulfillment. We're so different, this is crazy. But that's the point, right? So we carry on. From the MacBooked concrete floor of my unpaid summer internship, I wrote to Michael again. I'm organizing a symposium of lectures at the art gallery about the possibility of solidarity. Like, is it possible for someone in Sweden to be in solidarity with people suffering in a conflict somewhere else? Even though those people don't know anything about each other's lives, and the favor, if that is what it is, could never be returned. What do you think? Can you and I be mutually in solidarity with one another from across the world? Michael rephrased my question. Can someone be in unison with another person who is far away? I think if two people are able to depict their experiences in their lives to each other in a skillful way, enough to keep each other intrigued, then yes, emphatically. The shift from solidarity to unison is a shift towards sameness. It hinges on solidarity as a kind of identification. It also brings us closer to the idea of the unit, they riot as a unit, which is something he'd written in a different letter. In prison, an emergency or crisis forces people to overcome difference and find unison at knife point. What is it that brings Michael and I together? What would it mean for us to overcome difference? I think that, what Michael writes there, I also come back to it several times throughout the book. this kind of idea of depiction in a skillful way. It really points to like what is the role of art in all this. Like,
yeah, do you really respond strongly to your like skills as a writer, I guess, to describe like even a landscape? Because like you're talking about like you're describing to him like where you are, I think at one point, like just like your kind of banal everyday life, and he's just like, wow, like you really transport him to this place, or like he gets the sense of this, of the place you're writing from. So
yeah, I think that was something that, like, there was this whole question of, like, what are you getting from me? You know, I always felt like I was taking something from him. And that was the anxiety about using him, you know?
Do you feel like he was ever using you?
I mean, I guess that this question of, like, use as where the connotation is maybe abuse, or exploitation, or something like that, is, like, the idea of, like, the first idea about this project is that only I am in a position to use, you know, because I am in an elevated sort of position of privilege. But there is this whole, this whole aspect of eroticism which comes up in our correspondence, that a lot of prison correspondence is really about exchanging erotic letters and sending pictures, and then there are all these, like, rules about like how you are allowed to send like a sexy picture, and like what, it's almost like a passport photo, you know, where you like can't show your ears, you can't show your teeth, but you have to show your ears, you know, like that it's like you can like you can have a picture in underwear, but you have to be turned to your towards like there's all this kind of stuff.
You're right about that.
And this danger of it, of which I then cite, like when we were talking about it, like I'm weary of the turn to eroticism in our correspondence because I don't want, or I write that I'm like weary of it because I don't want our, what is the lines, like I don't want our like relation to ejaculate prematurely, or like you know, that if it like if we're on a trajectory towards or if we like lean into this being a project that's driven by desire, at what point does desire like end, and then what's left?
Yeah, and that way it really like echoed like any relationship really that you have, like romantic or with friendship, where this is like back and forth. This, I guess you do write about the I guess that's where there's a chapter about correspondence where you like get into that more deeply, but it's interesting.
Yeah, like this bit maybe about like there are lots of letters that I'm like a lot of the second the source material is basically other people's letters, this one between Ingeborg Bachmann and Paul Celan and Max Frisch.
That's in Love Lockdown?
That's in the correspondence chapter of Doing Time. But where like basically Paul Celan, this like big German Jewish, like one of the main kind of Holocaust poets after the war, has a feeling that his poetry collection has been negatively reviewed in the papers on an anti-Semitic basis. And then he asks Ingeborg Bachmann and Max Frisch, who are like public figures, also writers, to defend him publicly. And there's this like really kind of amazing letter correspondence between the three of them. Ingeborg Bachmann is dating Max Frisch and is the ex-partner of Paul Celan, so there's also that going on. And they're basically like, we're not sure that you're right, and we can't, like, and Max Frisch has this moment where he's like, you're giving me the choice, the only option you're giving me is being a reliable, do you understand that doesn't give me very much room to move? And like, I don't know, they're handling it in such a kind of like intellectual way, and it comes to like the core of like what does it mean to correspond, which is, or at least that's kind of how I'm using it, that you don't have to be in agreement, but you have to respond. You know, like Max Frisch writes, like, I've written so many letters and I've thrown them all out, but I can't leave you without an answer. So even if it's no, you know, and this is all coming as all these reflections are kind of in the context of Michael asking me to kind of make a promise to him that I'll meet him in the streets.
Oh, right, yeah.
And it's this moment where I'm like, can I actually promise that? And what would that mean?
Yeah. I feel like that's a really like intense moment where you're like, I was like, what are you gonna say? You're gonna promise? And you do.
Yeah. Because for so many reasons, there are like I guess there's also this thing about like Nietzsche, that like what defines the human is that it's the only animal that's able to make a promise. But then in the end, I think it was much more simple than that. It was just like realizing what can I do to make him happy right now.
Oh, right, yeah.
That it's like that really like this is another thing that really runs through the book, and I think it's also in the title, Doing Time, is like what is the temporality of crisis, and like what is time like inside prison, and it doesn't flow, you know. That's the kind of, it's more like a kind of a drip or a kind of like layering, and you.
Is that why there's all these ellipses on the cover?
No. We can talk about the cover. I wanted there to be art on the cover, but then there was this whole thing about like, what does a book need to do? What does the design of a book need to do? Does it have to communicate? And so in the end we ended up, this was like almost like making lines. It was like suggesting writing, I guess, and suggesting that like there could be more writing.
Right, like literally like the text message ...
Or like that these even like that it makes like you could write your own name there. Or like that there's a kind of like that it gives space for like more writing. I think that that's what I like hope with that this book is able to do, is like inspire like more thinking and more writing.
I think it is like super generative. Like when I was in the beginning, I was like, I couldn't, like, I was reading it and then I had to put it down, and I was like reflecting on like so many things that the subjects would like prompt in myself. So then it felt kind of narcissistic almost, because you read about narcissism a lot in regards to being like writing about other artists.
He's okay, right? He does that. Yeah.
But I lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I actually did bring these flowers because I was reading before I came here today in the Thief's Journal. Janae declares there's a close relationship between flowers and convicts. Writing from within prison, Janae has no obligation to truth. In fact, he has an interest in untruth, like Melina and Valentine in their non-existence. I don't know if that's maybe like a non sequitur, but I was just like, that was a funny line to put in there. Like, but really beautiful too. I found it really interesting.
I guess that's like you were referencing this Melina and Valentine. It's like this point where I'm talking about The Kiss of the Spider Woman, this novel by Manuel Puig from the 80s, 70s, 80s, this Argentine writer, which is about two people who are in prison together and they share a cell. And it's written all in dialogue. And partly it's, what's that line that you picked out that was kind of from there? It's about gaining access basically to sekanol, like this kind of sedation, something you take to not feel pain, and it's like, and they're trading food goods and things to get access to this, and it's really just to, and when they can't get that, they tell each other stories, because that's another way that you can like make time pass and make it easier, and this sort of idea of like easing time, passing time, doing time, like all these different sort of layers that come out, I think, in the reading of that novel, and like what the role that art plays in that, like storytelling, and also the role of correspondence, like producing some kind of togetherness. And that those two things stand slightly in conflict with this idea of doing which is more about guilt, which is the other aspect of the work,
Yeah.
and which is really mine, you know, that actually doesn't have anything to do with the other person.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that there is this whole guilt thing.
Yeah, do you want to read
Um,
like a section?
I'm just going to step in.
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure.
after this reading, feel free to raise your hand and ask any questions.
Yeah.
I didn't want to
Yeah.
interrupt it.
Yeah, okay, I'll read just a little bit and then and then we can go to the questions.
Yeah.
So I'm talking about this idea of like that I've written, all the essays kind of relate back to the previous essays, and in the last chapter I'm kind of going back to the first essay and like sort of critiquing my own writing, saying like what is, because I end up making a promise, right? I end up making a promise that I won't stop corresponding. And then I'm saying here, continue to correspond for how long? There's something hysterical about promising forever, something masochistic even, that assumes a debt that can never be repaid. A debt for what, exactly? And that the relationship of self to other will be stable and unchanging. It's also very romantic. From now until forever, that's how long I'll be true. This kind of temporality features heavily in the early music of Britney Spears. She was 16 at the time, a whole life ahead of her. In I'll Never Stop Loving You, she cites the day when the world stops turning and stars fall from the sky. Michael and I stopped corresponding at a time when both of our hearts were being pummeled. When I say that life got in the way, I guess that's what I mean. Perhaps I should have read your last letter more carefully back then. I finally wrote to him a year and a half later. I might have learned something. I might have spared myself some pain. But one is never permanently or only a victim. In some of Hardwick's letters, there's desperation. In others, total detachment, levity, cool. Trying to match the rhythm of the There's something almost perverse in the popular insistence that the other will be outraged or aggrieved by their representation. In certain respects, this has a kind of inbuilt narcissism because it suggests that a person can be broken or made by whoever is doing the representing. Time inside a prison might feel like an ocean without waves. What would happen to the tide if the world stopped turning, if the stars fell from the sky? But even though Michael looked out onto such an ocean for a long time, he still had a view of the horizon. 12 years is a long time, but it's not forever. When I got back in touch with Michael to discuss publishing this book, it was with pages of hand-wringing anxiety. He replied with enthusiasm, not about the book, but much bigger things. He's due for release very soon, he wrote. In fact, between me writing this sentence and it going to print, he's out, a whole life ahead of him. Along with this extraordinary piece of news was a reflection on the nature of containment. I was contained long before I was incarcerated, he wrote, by addiction, self-doubt, and heartache. Heartache. What a thing to say. What I've learned is that if we let our emotions guide our actions, sometimes it could be catastrophic. That's another quote. A broken heart makes a prison of the world. He's right. For years, I've lost myself at every collision with love, every seizure of optimism, as Hardwick wrote about an old friend, one fatal crush into the future after another. Can you stop using metaphors, said the accumulated voice of every guy I've ever died over. I don't understand what you mean, but Michael understood. On this matter, we were in total correspondence. One night in another love lockdown, I bought an extra rare steak and ate it outside in the rain. The waiter asked me to come inside, but I said no. My whole life is a metaphor, and I'm trapped inside it, drops falling into my large glass of red, a wet cigarette on Torchglas. Yeah. It's up there.
And he thanks you actually for putting him in there, in this book, right?
Yeah, he thinks it's a bit boring, but he's happy to be in it. Yeah.
I still open up for questions.
Have you and do you plan to meet Michael on the street?
Yeah, I think it would, like now he's out and we're like talking more like casually, it doesn't actually even seem strange.
Okay.
Like I think it changes a lot when he's like not in prison anymore and like this whole kind of weird apparatus of like how you get to write letters and how you get to speak on the phone with someone in prison. It like also produces this kind of insane like buffer between you and now it sort of seems strange that I would ever have like thought not to, because he's just like another person who I've known for years actually. So yeah, there's a question.
The short stories you talked about, like writing about like the banker and filmmaker and such, I don't know the timing of those, but like if they happened during the whole Michael correspondence, how did your feelings about those types of fiction and nonfiction change while you were talking about like representing other people, those people?
I think actually me starting to write those stories, some of them I even sent to him, like that they fed into my correspondence with him, because they were like stories about things that I had experienced. But I think it could also be that somehow I'm wondering now, I can't like quite like piece it together, but it could be that even as I started writing more things for myself, I stopped writing so many letters to him, that there could even be a kind of overlap in terms of like how that our correspondence kind of like lost steam, and I put my writing energy into other kinds of writing. But for sure, like how this essay, I wrote that essay for a writing conference at like a writing school in Sweden, where everyone was a fiction writer, and they had read Doing Time on the curriculum at that school, and the original title was Why I Can't Write Fiction. So it was this kind of game on that it was fiction and it was not. And it came back to Doing Time. It really it was the thing that maybe most manifested the anxiety, and also kind of was part of the process of like dealing with the anxiety that I had over writing the original piece.
You reference like confessional poetry a lot in the final essay, Love Lockdown, and it made me realize that I didn't really know much about the history of like Robert Lowell and that book Dolphin, where I guess he uses his ex-wife's.
I love that story. Also another it's not my story, or this is one I didn't make up.
Yeah.
It's like a really great letter correspondence. Robert Lowell was getting divorced from Elizabeth Hardwick. She was an essayist, really great writer. Anyway, and he wrote a book of poems where he used quite a lot of her letters that they had been corresponding as they were getting divorced. So the letters are really kind of intense.
Yeah.
And he used the letters in writing his poems. And then he wrote to Elizabeth Bishop, who was one of his best friends, is another poet. He asked, "Can I publish this?" And her reply is just amazing. She's like art is just not worth that much. And that was kind of really stuck with me, it also reappears throughout the book, because I was really like,
yeah, because before you decide to publish this whole thing, you're like, it's not really worth it.
Yeah.
To deal with all the questions that it generates, really. But it does generate a lot of questions, I think, which is why the book's interesting.
And I think also what makes it worth it in the end is that it made me have it let a confrontation play out that actually turned out to be much more productive than it was scary or something like that. I think that if I had stuck to my if I had remained scared, if I hadn't done it or something, it's another example of that is I talk about Diane Arbus's photographs, where she this photographer in the 40s and 50s in New York was taking pictures of lots of other subjects that she thought they were freaks, you know, like gay people and like Siamese twins and like, you know, and like and the question that she asks is would it have been better if I looked away? Like, because in the end, her photographs are some of the only photographs that exist of these like subcultures. So it's like a valuable document. Or I mean, this book is not that, but like that's another way. That's another like spin on that question. To kind of counter Elizabeth Hardwick's like quite hard stance, or no, Elizabeth Bishop's.
Yeah.
Other one. Yeah. Sorry. More questions.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so actually just for both of you, so I'm paraphrasing here, but you mentioned, if fiction releases us from accountability, I'm not sure what the exact quote was, but I don't think you actually directly in the book, so I was wondering if maybe you can discuss that here. But I'm also curious what your response to that would be, Tiziana.
Does fiction, can you repeat that?
Does fiction, I guess, releases from accountability? If it's all fiction. Yeah. And you've kind of hinted at that, Kristian, that some of these stories are not quite true, so.
Yeah.
That is something I was thinking a lot about because we were talking about fiction, like, what comes up a lot in the book, like what is the truth? It's like framed, how it's like constantly framed, and then there's like the transmission, either like through text, or I was thinking a lot about the written text versus like oral transmission of experience or facts. So yeah, I don't know, like accountability.
I mean, I think that there is a kind of conclusion in like, it's not like a manifesto, and I think that it's not like a dogmatic like book really, but there is a kind of conclusion between the lines of the last chapter, which is, I think that that regardless of whether something is fiction or not, like being a writer is just like a super complicated thing, and you're always like using yourself, and you're always using other people's experiences, and you're never going to be able to resolve that. But that doesn't mean like then you just have to own it.
Yeah.
Like you can't like think that you can be that being a writer can be a kind of like moral position, because it's just not. And the sooner you kind of come to terms with that without being like an asshole, the better, you know?
Yeah. Because I feel like it's funny for me because sometimes I'm like the artist and other times I'm the writer. And so I experience like both sides of that. And definitely from the position of like being asked to write about someone else's work, and then like there is so much blurriness sometimes, like even like with Alison Yip's show, where she asked me to write a text, and it could be whatever I wanted. She's like, so I chose not to write a didactic text because she had already asked someone to do that. So I'm like, yes, I don't have to be like given that task of trying to sell this work or whatever. But then I borrowed a lot of her questions, and like I don't know, like she had all these questions where each painting. There's always like a set of 2 paintings, and she asked 2 different clairvoyants to answer the question she has, and then I borrowed those questions and then asked like a psychic, sometimes the same questions or related ones, to find an answer to her question. And it was really strange actually, like thinking about depiction, because then she used me in her, like one is like, what will cause me great embarrassment? And one is like a kiss. One painting's a kiss that's like unrequited, and that she paints, and the other one's like an artist talk. And like Denise hadn't asked me to do this talk yet, so it's also a funny like foreshadow to this moment. And then, Alison wouldn't do the artist talk, so she made the painting. But then I was like, wow, I'm like desperate. I don't want to do the artist talk, but I'll do it and like risk this like great embarrassment. But like,
hopefully not a great.
No, but it's not. But it's like, you know, just like, I feel like the anxiety around that, and like speaking in public, kind of like past anxieties that I have. But it's funny, like, but when I think about a lot of my like writing, especially as I like began to get asked to do more things, it's like there was this like weirdness of being like, okay, I'm writing for this person, but then suddenly their subjects I really would like embody, especially if I really connected with it. And so then there was this like, oh, like gloriness of like obviously someone's drawn to you because they think you can say something or have some sort of insight, but then at the same time, like you're kind of, I don't know, it kind of creates this like funny intimacy that is like unexpected.
I think that's
or
also,
you talk about intercourse literally, like in correspondence. So.
and it's synonym for correspondence,
Yeah.
intercourse, but like there's a lot of love in that, right? There's so much love, I think, in this book, like because it is a little bit like with love, that you kind of, you are going to lose yourself, and you are going to take the other person on, and it's going to be really scary, and like there's a huge risk involved, but you kind of have to do it every time, and you have to also be like willing to like navigate that. I think like another example that comes up in the book was this correspondence I had with Naeem Mohammed and Chloe Bass about this film that they had in Venice in 2015. Which was about a Dutch activist in Bangladesh, and where they interviewed this man, and he had been in prison in the 70s, and those interviews affect him so badly that well, I mean, there's no causality, there's no direct causality, but he happens to die just as the film premieres, and we have this like really difficult conversation afterwards where Chloe is like, we're used to thinking about art as a gift, but now I'm not so sure. And like, I mean, there's some really poignant correspondence, and she says that like this is, in the end, I think what we get to is that it's just, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It just means that it's like it's a really difficult conversation. And I think that's also what Michael means when he says like it depends on you being able to depict something in a skillful way.
Yeah.
It is this kind of like taking care and.
And what about with the question Denise has with like depicting it even as fiction, but then the accountability in it?
I think my response to that is that it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, I guess that maybe turning something into fiction is like removes you from like a legal like problem, but like in terms of your personal relationships to other people, like but I think the thing about in your own writing, you're always like you're being so vulnerable too. You're not just like being like Truman Capote's like unanswered prayers, like giving out everyone else's shit. It's like it always comes with your shit too. So I guess it's like a fair game almost in that way. Or at least I've been very careful to like dish equally of my own. Yeah.
Any last questions?
I kind of had another one. Yeah, but I was just like when I was reading it, especially with the correspondence between you and Michael, I kept wondering if there wasn't the horizon of 12 years or even less than that, or that he would be released and eventually out on the street, and you could possibly meet in person, and there's not this issue of one person being in prison and the other not. Like if you would have felt the same, like if he was in there for life, like he was never getting out, like have you thought about that when you read it? Like if it would have changed anything, or
I think in the beginning when I started writing to him, it seemed impossible that he would ever get out. Like it just seemed like it was so long, and I guess I must have felt like that to him too. Just like 12 years, I guess at that point he'd been in for like 3 or something. So and I never had in mind that it would go on for so long either. So for me, there was really no like other side of the project. I hadn't thought it through at all. Like I think that's also what's kind of maybe special, hopefully, about this book, is that it's all the reflections are happening in real time over the course of like 4 years. But it is an interesting thing about, I think it's something that we didn't like really get to, but like all these reflections about what it actually means to be in prison philosophically, like what it does to your subjectivity, what it does to your experience of difference in relation to other people, and what it does to like privilege. It like creates this very kind of concrete line, you know, are you inside or are you outside, and like how, and I
You use this
deconstruct
word
that a bit.
vacation too, I noticed, because it just reminded me of people I know who have been in prison, and they often refer to it as when they were on vacation, and then you would like describe it as like a gay vacation at one point. So I was like, oh, is that like language that you got from Michael, or
I mean,
is that just like a kind of like insight that you gathered from?
this was this kind of weird thing that I realized, or that Michael told me, that he was on this he was in like protective custody, or which you can apply to if you feel that you're not safe on the main line. And most of the people who apply to be there are SNY, it's called sensitive needs. Most of the people who apply to be there are either like gay or maybe they're like in for something really horrendous, like pedophilia or like mass murderers or something. So Michael's estimate was that like 87, he said something really specific, like 87% of all the people here in SNY are gay. So like everyone's like hooking up and being like boyfriends, and but obviously it's also like still super dangerous. And
Oh yeah, and I also thought it was interesting to read about how the correspondence actually did have a benefit to him in terms of him, like for the guards, for example, they knew that there was someone out there, like, aware of his existence, and that actually protected him.
Yeah, that's one of those things that like that everyone knows when someone gets a letter, and just for people to know that like, oh, this person has people on the outside, they're not alone.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, they're not. It gives them an opportunity to be something other than that like number that they're assigned. But like, but that's like an interesting part of it too. Also that like some of the ways in which I was able to be directly useful was like passing on letters to like people who knew who were in other prisons, and like giving him information about certain things like HIV medications and stuff that he didn't have access to.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I'm just checking to see if maybe I misunderstood, or if I went on a jag for a minute. Do you think that guilt is an experience that is more of a private experience than some other emotional relationships, or relationships?
I think what I meant when I said that the guilt was mine and it didn't kind of belong to our relationship, or was that he had never said anything to make me feel guilty, and neither actually had anybody else. Like it was always this kind of weird, like sort of ghost or something inside me. I kept being sort of haunted by this idea that I might have done something wrong. And even as I like did those lectures afterwards, every time I would be like, oh, now is the time. Like this will be it, where like the mob will come, and it never happened. It was really like myself kind of like just being full of doubt and really like asking myself like lots of questions, which I think in the end was good. It could have been a negative thing if it had meant that I didn't do anything. You know, if I was so paralyzed by that anxiety that I didn't write, but I did. You know, so I think it was good. It became intellectual in a way. But I wonder about guilt being private. I suppose in a kind of religious sense almost it is.
I don't think so, but is that as private as love? It makes a relation, is what I was thinking.
Interesting, like, question though. I don't like to keep it as a secret.
Actually, just to add on to it, because the summary you spoke about like kind of awareness and sort of her writing and the reaction to the way that she approached her writing in a text, and the comment that she'd used, or maybe you used, was anyway, like write anyways, or something like that, and just, yeah, like just get into the moral entanglement, which you just described here. Like it's more productive if you do, because you have a chance to ask those questions, and you know, not to just assume that something's settled and we don't touch that topic, or we don't publish this correspondence, because then nobody's thinking, right? We're not constantly questioning our boundaries, our limits. That was an interesting sort of example or case study, I guess, that you brought up alongside the end progress, and would have been better to look away at these two instances. But if there are no more questions, I can feel the energy shifting. Do either of you want to talk about your upcoming publications? It sounds like you both have some. Or should we just close and...
Do you want to talk about it? I guess, like, well, does this book overlap at all with your upcoming book, with Blank Dimanche Press? Is that the name of the press? Broken Dimanche.
Yeah, no, it's kind of. It's a lot about love, and it's about love and postmodernism and architecture and pop music. I mean, there's like, obviously I'm the same person writing it, but it's like, that is definitely fiction, and I've enjoyed that so much, like being, and it's not uncomplicated ethically either, but it's definitely like another world, so that's really nice.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Chris, what about yours? Surviving illness and...
My book is like funny. It's like it came about as like a translation project of like translating some poems from English to Italian, and I'm doing now I'm like translating some of myself, but I'm working with Federica Guetti, who was here like I guess right before the pandemic, and Sonia D'Alto, and it just came about from this exhibition in Palermo where I wrote like it was called a stink script, and I was letting myself really indulge in like certain like mythologies of Palermo where I was born, and like I was thinking about Saint Agatha and this mythology of this like martyr who had her like breasts cut off, and they sell these like cookies that are in the shape of these breasts for like to commemorate her, and I was like thinking a lot about that, and so I made this perfume with Megan Hepburn, who we worked with for like Serena Lee's show, and we made this like I wrote the script, which was this poem, and then she turned it into a perfume. But yeah, in Italy, people don't, there's not such a strong Anglo presence actually. So then we were like, oh, we have to translate it. Then it became this like big book somehow, and and it's like a lot of the eyelash on the monochrome, and then some like individual poems, and then like a few new poems. And I was supposed to write like a new book for inside this book, but it's been really hard. With all the sort of interruptions for the past couple of years, so but there's some new material. It's kind of like I kind of think of it as like a funny remix, and then it's like it's going to be like bilingual, so it's funny because some poems actually end up working better in Italian, and some are like impossible to translate. So it's like this weird. It's been really psychedelic actually to do, because I have to revisit all this writing, and then I realize, oh, the writing was therapy, and now I have to like really look at it closely, and it's very embarrassing. To like try to explain things, and they're like, what do you mean here? And I was like, well, I haven't really thought about it, and I'm trying to like go back. So it's been like an interesting process. And yeah, I guess I get to do it while I'm alive. That's just like, wow, most people don't have to go through this process, but it is interesting. So I don't know what's going to come out of it after, but and that's coming up. Hope it will be done this year, but either in the spring or the fall.
Cool. Thank you so much, Tiz, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you so much for listening.